Hi everyone, I'm Katie Brenner and I am going to be doing my critique on Chris's final paper titled Cluey and Critical Rhetoric, a critique of freedom and domination in Chris Cluey's lustful cock monster letter to Emmett C. Burns. And I just wanted to start out by talking a little bit about what Jim had said as far as our final critiques go. He had talked a little bit about looking at things that we need to be aware of when we're looking at publishing, and just ways to take these papers a little bit further so that they will be able to be published or to be taken to a conference and things like that. So I'm just going to focus on some of the things that I had read in those little readings that Jim had given to us. I want to start out by saying that I really enjoyed this paper, as well as Adam's, which I'll critique later. It was just a really, really great paper to read, and I want to talk some of the things that I really like, which coincided with the readings that Jim gave us. So, wanted to start out by talking a little bit about Berkowitz, and they're talking about publishing and that a critic should be able to argue or demonstrate that a method is meaningful and appropriate. And I think Chris did a fantastic job of this. He talks about critical rhetoric, and he goes really into detail as far as McCarroll, how McCarroll conceptualizes critical rhetoric, and he also talks about queer theory and how that wraps up into critical rhetoric, which I thought was really, really interesting. And he did a really good job of just setting up these concepts so that the reader was able to understand and see where he was going with all of that. So I think he just did a really, really good job of making sure that the method that he was using was meaningful for the text. And he also obviously links back Cluey's text a lot while he's talking about that. So I thought that was done really, really well. Berkowitz also talks about how a good critic should be able to invent social knowledge rather than just talking about, something that we've already been reiterating points that we already know. And I also think this was something that Chris did really, really well. I think that profanity in Chris Cluey's text is something that, if people have been writing about it or if people have been talking about it, the profanity is what they go for. So Chris could have really taken a good look at that and, looked at the rhetorical aspects and things like that, but he actually took it a step further and looked at Chris Cluey's profanity as an exemplar of Cluey's white privilege and his place in society, and how that gave him a different way to come about and a different option for the uses of profanity in his speaking. So I thought that was a really, really cool way to look at it, and it brought out some different. It made the audience think critically about issues of race and Chris Cluey's own heteronormativity when it comes to this text. So I thought that was really a great thing that Chris did as well. And as far as engaging different lines of inquiry, that was another thing that Berkowitz had spoken about in the article. And that was, again, Cluey's use of language as evidence of his white privilege. That's just, it's like I said, a different way to look at something that has been a piece of this rhetoric that a lot of people have been talking about. And then secondly, I wanted to look at Alan was one of the other readings that I had focused on. And one of the things that I had noticed in Chris's paper that was originally going to be a critique, but the more that I thought about it, the more I think that it actually helped out the argument that Chris was trying to make, and I want to make that a point right now. I noticed that Chris's voice was very evident, I feel like, in a lot of his critique, talking about Cluey's incredible work, as he mentions on one of the pages in his final paper. Also talking about, his advocacy, which is, quote, his work was admirable and productive. So, it's obvious that Chris's voice is there throughout, and he does have some sort of a stake in what he's talking about. And at first I was going to really question that choice. But the more I thought about it, when I was reading through Allen, they were talking about how rhetorical scholarship is much more personal, and the introduction of idiosyncrasies of the individual play an intentional part. And I thought this was a really, really, really good example of that. He was able to tie in the fact that this is actually something that he is very he has a stake in what he's talking about and he's passionate about, and you can tell. When also another thing that I was thinking when it came to that is in McCarroll's article when he's talking about critical rhetoric, he talks about critique is not detached and impersonal. It has its object in what it's against. So when it comes to critical rhetoric, the critic can't remove himself or herself completely from what they're talking about. Like their argument stems from something that means something to them. So I just wanted to point out that was something that he did well after thinking about it for a while. So I just wanted to make those points and say that these were the things that really I thought linked up really well with these things that were in the readings. And as far as publishing, I think that Chris is definitely on the right track. Some of the things, that I noticed while I was reading, and some of the things that kind of brought up a couple questions. Chris takes about a page and a half to talk about the critiques of McCarroll's critical rhetoric. And I thought that was an interesting choice. Personally, I thought that much detail as far as trying to look at all the things that the negative parts of critical rhetoric. I don't necessarily know if I agree with how you went about that, and I see why you did it, because you were able to talk about McCarroll's response to it, and you were able to tie that into your further critique. So I understand why. I think maybe for further reference, if you take this any further, you can probably shorten that up and just kind of go over just a little bit about the critiques, because I kind of feel like it weakened the argument, considering your entire paper was based around McCarroll's theories of critical rhetoric. So the last thing you want to go, do is let the reader think about the things about it that are negative. And I understand that there's a time and a place for those sorts of things, but I think in your paper, considering that it was the theoretical background for what you were doing, I think there could have been a little less emphasis on it. That was the first thing. And then the second thing that I had a little bit of trouble with, but it didn't necessarily wasn't that big of a deal. I did catch on as I was reading a little bit further, and I was getting into detail. I didn't necessarily always remember that your argument about Chris Cluey's queering of football was actually the critique of emancipation. So I think if you take this further, one thing that you could possibly toy with is adding a little bit of McCarroll throughout, just to remind the reader what you're talking about and how his queering of football exemplifies McCarroll's critique of emancipation and how these things are exemplifying that. So that was one other thing. And then one other question that I had, and I've done a little bit of research as I've done critiques for your paper throughout the semester and things like that. I don't know a whole heck of a lot about the outside context and things as far as Cluey's letter, but I was wondering, did he not receive any critique as far as his profanity? Because I know that you, throughout the semester, kind of were toying with the idea of focusing on that, and that is definitely a huge part. It's, you can't forget about that. That is the big part of his rhetoric. So I'm wondering, like, what were the critiques? Like, you make mention that because of his white privilege, he was able to get away with using this language, and obviously, considering how well his rhetoric was accepted and how, it pushed certain certain boundaries when it came to the campaign and things like that, and people were getting really excited about it, and the T-shirts and things like that. I think you definitely make the argument that his rhetoric was effective, but can you really make the argument that nobody, I'm just wondering a little bit about what people were saying about his profanity, because I think that could add a little bit. If you're going to make the argument that he got away with it, I would assume that he, definitely got away with it, and there's so little critique that there is just no reason to go into it, and maybe there is. I just found myself wondering that as I was reading. So that's one thing to think about. And then finally, just a little bit when it comes to your implications. I don't know if you had heard, but in addition to Kluwe getting cut from the Vikings, I also read in some of the other articles and things like that, Brendan Nyambadejo also got cut from the Ravens, which is interesting, and I know that you make mention of it in your implications and in how his place in the campaign may have affected it, may not have, but that may also be a little bit of an interesting something to talk about when it comes to your implications. So that was about all I had, and I really, really enjoyed this paper. I thought it was really set up well, and I think you definitely is something that would be great to publish or present at a conference. So thank you, and good luck in the future.